So as we have a change of players, I'll just offer a few reflections. I mean, it's very interesting that we moving into the concrete sort of aspects as well of how can that lead to change in the way the water sector itself and what interventions are funded, because we heard from this the insurance company their willingness to engage as well in investing in prevention. I've had some personal experience actually working with the insurance industry. I think there's still a lot that can be done in this area. So we're now going to, and one other thing I would add as well is that the emphasis here has been a lot on Europe. The Europe Resilience Water Strategy is actually providing us with a framework to do this, because there's a lot of emphasis on living labs, on experimentation at the national, at the level of specific basins, etc. So these models are good to talk about in theory, but in practice they're actually quite difficult to put in place. So we really need to identify what works and do that. And this is, by the way, a sort of call and announcement for the next roundtable, which will focus on models for financing freshwater restoration, because we heard about the importance of investing in prevention, investing in nature-based solutions, but a key challenge is whether there are revenue streams and whether they are investable propositions. So this roundtable will take place in China, in Beijing, with the Ministry of Water Resources, where there's a lot of experience in investing in those models as well. So without further ado, I will soon hand over to Josefina, and I'd like to also acknowledge Josefina's critical role in getting all this together. And she's really the embodiment of somebody who's been working on the water side, and the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Environment, and has had the foresight for a very long time to think in terms of resilience and the importance of engaging with the financial sector. So I'd like to give her a special round of applause. In cinema, they have lifetime awards, so I think she deserves one by all means. And with that, I'll leave you to your panel. Thank you.
Sophie. Okay, welcome. Welcome to this second session for today. And I'm Josefina Maestro. I'm from the University of Alcalá, formerly with the government of Spain, coordinating the economic analysis of the Water Framework Directive for a long time. Okay. And I think I want to think about this session as a session of moving to action. No? Yesterday we talked a lot about exposure, being aware of what the risks were, and I think now we're thinking about what is happening on the ground. How are we translating all these ideas about the material risks that we have been identifying? Are we really, is this making a difference? And I think we have a fantastic panel who's going to talk about how we are making a difference. For context setting, I would like to give you a little bit of a brief summary of a study that we did in the University of Alcalá, and we studied 5 banks in Spain and what they were doing. And basically, I'm going to give you the 5 messages or the key takeaways from the study itself. Basically, what we saw, and I think it's normal in a country like this. I mean, it's not an accident that we are here with the Bank of Spain and talking about these things, is that the banking system, so the private banks, are really thinking about water. So water is in the radar in different ways, but it is. Second, that exposure mapping is improving. The methodologies, how different banks are looking at how much their portfolios are exposed, is different. We are using different methodologies. People are doing different things. They are trying to manage the best they can, and we probably can hear from one of them here in Spain. But the fact is that things are going. I mean, the fact that they are using different methodologies, it also calls already for a role of the regulator. you know, to try to see how we can really be comparable in the way we use these methodologies. So that's the second message. The third message is that most banks still remain more in a qualitative type of analysis of the exposure, and they're doing things with this information already, but I think still, you know, they are not really quite doing the bridge between the hydrological risk, if you want, and the credit risk, the risk for the financial system. Not all of them. There are very good examples of good practice, but still there is something there. Is that basically that there is an operational challenge now that we have found in the study. My colleague from the University of Alcalá, Carlos Mario Gómez, is there also, who did this study, is building the bridge between the hydrological indicators and the prudential parameters. So that's where we are now, and trying to make it explicit on how we are doing this bridge. So this is a little bit of context setting, because we are going to talk about that. We are going to talk about banks, what is their role. We are going to talk about investors, you know, how we do it. We are talking about disclosure, you know, what is the role of disclosure. And I think I want to recognize also the important role of CDP in all this, and I will ask a question to them as well later in the session. Okay, so we have panelists. Again, this has been recorded. My panelists will have 4 minutes each for the first question, and Kate here at the end, Kate Lamb, will be making a little bit of comments and also asking questions to the speakers. First of all, we have Tom Hegarty. He is the Associate Director for Transition Planning and Targets in the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and he's been heavily involved in developing difficult methodologies to try to deal with this. We have also, from the bank's perspective, Antonio Blanco is the head of sustainability risks. He insisted that I said risk, not only sustainability, risks, from one of the main banks in Spain, which is the BBVA, who's also working worldwide. So, you know, really, anything they do, you know, it affects many countries. Then is Luc Susans. Luc, we had a little conversation before. You're doing very important work. Not everybody is, but I mean, he is the head of sustainability and transition strategy in Jefferies, no? And specializing in water investment risk and sustainable finance products for institutional investors. So you are working with big investors and seeing how they can deal with water risks. And last but not least, Kristen. Kristen James is the sustainability leader at Ceres and is an expert in mobilizing investor action on water risks. She leads the Value in Water Finance initiative, which brings together investors representing $18 trillion. My goodness, in assets. So everybody else also has good figures, eh? Don't worry, we will see them. So it's very impressive, you know, it's very impressive because we are not really only talking about what we need to do, the analysis we do, etc., but we are really talking about people who are actually trying to make a difference, and they're having an impact because they have a lot of people who have been really working on this, and also, you know, investors and investment decisions and sector decisions. So I'm going to start with you, Tom. I think we agreed that you were going to be the first one. Great. And Tom, your framework now has been adopted by 730 companies. So, and the numbers here is representing $9 trillion in market capitalization and $22 trillion in assets under management. No? You know, all these people are doing disclosure, and what is this disclosure telling us? No? What is really, you know, telling us about their level of risk, their awareness of risk? And the second part of my question is that what have you seen, because you've been working a lot in developing methodologies, what have you seen were the methodology gaps to really, you know, act on the disclosure information?
For sure. And so we're really pleased to see how much enthusiasm there has been in the market for the TNFD materials. As you're saying, the number of adopters of the materials is growing all the time. And in our status report last year, we were able to find over 500 first and second generation reports already out there in the market. So we're seeing disclosure growing really rapidly. And water is coming through in those disclosures. So I had a quick look through some of the financial institution reporting before this meeting. And so two examples that I thought were quite interesting. One is NBIM, so the Norges Bank Investment Management portfolio, and they did quite a detailed analysis of water in their tech holdings. So that's 27% of the portfolio is in the technology sector, and they found there was obviously a really strong dependence on water in that sector, but also impacts particularly through pollution. And they also identified that a lot of their holdings at the asset level were in water-stressed areas in Europe, the US, India, China, and Japan. And they actually divested from a few companies on the basis of poor water management as a result of that analysis. Also really interesting is the Banco de Bogotá. So they did some analysis of their holdings in the Magdalena Basin of Colombia, which represents about 80% of the Colombian economy. And so again, they were able to prioritize first their clients based on likely exposure to water-related issues. And they found particular potential risks in their palm oil sector from floods, but also in their energy holdings due to potential water stress. So some really interesting indicators of exposure coming through, but that is obviously then pointing to the challenges, which is going from that, as you were saying, sort of a qualitative exposure, potential risks, to trying to add that up to something that is a financially material effect at the portfolio level. And we were hearing yesterday about how financial institutions need to start thinking about correlations across different assets. So a drought isn't just going to be on one asset, but it'll be across a whole region. And how do you start to capture some of those correlations and start to add that up to a financial risk? The other challenge that every report that I read sort of raises is the challenge of identifying locations in portfolios. We are seeing a lot of progress on that. Financial institutions are identifying locations and doing analysis at the location level, often for a subset of the portfolio where they have some information. It's not always super precise, but it's enough to start making some inferences about what risks might be. And Barclays is a really interesting example where they just focused in on the mining and energy sectors in their portfolio and did some really detailed analysis of those sectors. And that's obviously, those sectors are slightly easier because they are sectors where there are potential nature-related issues in the direct operations and they're very concentrated in particular locations. So, but nonetheless, they were able to demonstrate that there was quite a lot of insight that you could gather just in those sectors. So we're seeing lots of innovation coming through, progress is being made, but I think those are the two challenges that I would highlight at the moment that are particularly of interest.
So disclosure is working.
Yeah, well.
and talking about systems effects, at least in countries like Spain, what we found is there is this compounding risks, so that you have together heat waves, you have fires, you have droughts, so it's much difficult to manage all that, even for, insurers or other companies. Okay, I'm going to go on, Antonio, with you. Antonio, I think here in Spain, really we can see that now the supervisory bodies, they're really, increasing the expectations about what we need to do. And they are looking at everybody, and I think you are looking at each other, in fact. So I think you, in a way, you are leading. The BBVA has a very important role in Spain. You are very good at, you are very good at doing studies. You have a very strong department of economic analysis and studies. Is one of the most important think tanks in Spain in economic analysis. But at the same time, you have a very strong operational branch. So you are moving in between those two worlds, which is also very important. That helps you thinking that we think that you are leading these processes as well. So you are maybe ahead of the supervisory, expectations. So tell us a little bit about that. What are you doing in terms of things that maybe the supervisories are not asking for yet, and how you are maybe pricing or making decisions on your portfolio and the loans that people are asking you? So.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you for having me here, and thank you to Bank of Spain for hosting this event that is very, very useful for us. But for BBVA, sustainability is a pillar of the current strategic cycle, and it was in the previous cycle. So because we strongly believe that sustainability offers great opportunities for our business, but at the same time, sustainability is a lever to achieve resilience in our business and in our clients' business. So sustainability is a risk management tool. This is something that we should keep in mind, that and I think it's necessary to remember this in these times where sustainability is somehow criticized in some jurisdictions. For us, this is a risk management tool. And in this sense, if we talk about water, water for us is fully or very embedded or interlinked with developing physical risk, climate risk measuring capabilities. We find that there are great synergies between managing water risk and measuring physical risk. Some time ago, we decided that we wanted to develop a fully in-house approach in measuring physical risk. I think that we have a different approach compared to most of the banks, but we are betting for developing our own capabilities because we find that we need to fully understand what we are measuring, and you cannot fully achieve this if you buy an external solution. So we are making a great effort to develop our own modeling, hazard by hazard, in a project that we call BBVA Adapta. And in this roadmap, we have prioritized the developing of the modeling of water-related hazards. So our priorities being droughts or floods, for instance, in this developing. And we are a user of the TNFD approach. We think that is very valuable. Help us to improve the way we identify the risk in our portfolio. But we use it in a way that we pay more attention to dependencies compared to impacts. I'm a risk guy, and I tend to pay more attention to the outside-in impact in our portfolio. I am not saying that impact is not important, and it can generate, of course, financial risks. But let's say that we have a 70-30 approach to this question. If you ask me where are we ahead, I would say some points. For instance, we are developing these internal capabilities in terms of measuring. For instance, for drought hazards, we are reaching some interesting outcomes. For instance, in the south of Spain, we are identifying preliminarily that we could see an increase of the drought indexes using, for instance, the CDD index in the south of Spain on average around 10% in the coming decade, using a central scenario. But this is only an average over the south of Spain. In some areas, the increase can be even worse. And we feel somehow comfortable with the results because we fully control the way we achieve them. We are working very hard in the geolocation databases. This is a pain point for all of the banks. We need to have a better picture of where the assets are located to measure the risk. And this is a heavy lifting for all of us. I think this is a great effort. We are working in developing geospatial visualization capabilities because you cannot understand this risk if you don't have a geospatial visualization. And we are providing these tools not only to the risk teams, but to the business teams, because this can be a very powerful support for our advisory activities with our clients. So we have a sort of obsession in the sense that everything that we develop for risk management should have a business use. It's something that we always try to do. We are leveraging on artificial intelligence to obtain data and to better understand the outcomes of the calculations. And we are taking the results of the calculations to risk scores that we embed in our rating tools. So this is the way to achieve an impact in pricing, the rating of the clients. So in summary, I think that we are moving forward in reaching a more quantitative approach in processes like risk assessment, ICAP, for instance. We translate, for instance, these growth indexes that we project for our portfolio. We connect them with the IFRS 9 engine in the ICAP. Very importantly, we are moving forward in improving our risk admission guidelines for specific sectors. And this is I think that is very important. Christopher was mentioning data centers in the previous session. For instance, we have introduced specific admission guidelines for data centers where we consider the water efficiency of the assets that we finance, considering the cooling technology that they use, the type of water they use, the water stress in the location where they operate, and this is part of our decision making. So I think that is going to the practical use of water. No? For instance, we are developing satellite information use for our agricultural portfolio. We are measuring the crop conditions to project the potential yields that the clients can have. And this is a part of our risk management toolbox. And we are sharing this information with the clients. So these are some of the examples of the things that we do. And we are moving forward in having a value proposition for our clients in 3 pillars. Advisory.
Can we leave it for later? So you
Okay.
okay.
I wanted to talk about the value proposition because
we will do it
the business side wants me to mention this.
No, but thank you very much for the examples, because I think the examples help a lot. So because otherwise we're always talking about, we're analyzing, we are looking, and we are producing guidance, but what it really means for operations. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. Now I'm going to talk to my investors advisors here, and maybe I start with you, Kristen. Okay, Kristen, the Value and Water Finance Initiative is engaging 71 companies, no, across different sectors. Maybe you can tell us which sectors you are working with, and you have some criteria that you are telling investors that they need to, they need to be aware of before they decide to help or to invest in a company in a specific sector, no, and. Something very interesting apart from that is the same questions I was asking before to Tom, how is it changing, the actual behavior or the practice of the sectors themselves, these changes in investors' preferences, if you want.
Yeah, great. Well, happy to address all of that. But first off, thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful event and the gracious hosts for these 2 days. Series may be newer to some in the audience, so let me start there of who we are. So we're an NGO based in the United States, and for the last 35 years, we've been working with institutional investors and companies, really mobilizing them around opportunities, solutions, but also the risks and challenges with a variety of sustainability issues, including our issue at hand today, water, but also nature and climate. And so, as Josefina alluded to, working with institutional investors on water risk is a priority for my team and has been for about a dozen years or so. And, over that time, we've definitely seen increasing interest and sort of uptake from institutional investors on the concept of water risk and action around water risk. And so back in 2022, we recognized that we really needed to take a page in the playbook from some of our climate work where investors were actively engaging with companies in their portfolio around climate risk and moving forward with mitigating that risk. And so with a number of partners, including the Dutch government, we launched the Valuing Water Finance Initiative, and continue to grow and bring investors into the fold as, like we've heard today, more and more investors, it's hard to ignore the issues associated with water risk. And so right out of the gate, what we first order of business was we really needed to set what the North Star was for this initiative. On the climate side, maybe it's a bit more straightforward, but as we've heard, in the last 2 days, there's so many dimensions of water that we really need to think through, and all are arguably equally important. So we set out a group of what we call corporate expectations for valuing water. We co-developed them with the institutional investors, our advisors, other NGOs in the space, and they really hit the 6 key dimensions of water. So water use, water quality, which we've talked about, it hasn't been maybe discussed as much, but critically important, ecosystem protection, water access, and then also looking at the governance pieces, so looking internally at oversight within companies, board oversight, executive oversight, and then lastly, public policy. So really recognizing can't do it all within your own 4 walls, your own institution, but you really need to work with decision makers and policy makers on overall governance issues. So with those expectations in mind, Ceres has supported this group of institutional investors really in mobilizing them to work with these 71 companies in 4 focus sectors. So food, beverage, apparel, and high-tech sectors. And so we support investors as they're engaging with these companies, working on understanding the challenges, helping to identify solutions and overcome these risks. So you might be asking, well, what does she mean exactly by engaging with companies? So just to share sort of how that works in practice. So investors, and sometimes individual investors, sometimes teams of investors, are dialoguing with companies. So having deep granular conversations with companies in their portfolio, really better understanding, where do these material water risks lie? How can we help work together on solutions? So this can involve deep dialogue, this can involve communications, correspondence, this can involve shareholder rights deployment in the form of shareholder resolutions that go for votes. This can involve activation at annual general meetings. There are many different tools in the toolbox, and all of them have a place and a time, and certain investors feel more comfortable with different approaches. But we support bringing our water expertise to investors in these engagements. So you asked for examples, so just wanted to share out some of the recent movements we've seen as a result in part of these investor engagements with corporates. So one example to share is one of the world's largest fast food companies, stemming from a variety of engagements with investors, committed to the first time to working in their supply chain on water and nature risks. So a big deal for one of the world's largest fast food companies. Recently, we had a large commodity provider that really was reflecting on their poor performance in some of the more governance areas, and so committed to doing more with linking executive incentives to water risk and tying in more board oversight. We recently had a major apparel company that decided to move forward a water policy that was aligned with these investor corporate expectations, recognizing that these were really, really critical. More and more examples I can provide. Data centers, we've seen a lot of movement around data centers and work to that end as well. So definitely a lot of good examples to share. I'll just close in mentioning, one of our big tools that we use to support investors is a benchmark where we evaluate where the corporates sit in regards to those corporate expectations that I just outlined. And there's 26 KPIs behind them, so a lot of data analysis using CDP data, other publicly available data. And we evaluate every 2 years sort of how are companies progressing. And so there is a good news story. So 48 of the 71 companies improved their scores. With our benchmark that was released late last year, 83% have set water targets, either in their operations and their operations and supply chain. There's increasing board oversight. But on the negative side, water quality, which was mentioned before, is getting a lot less attention, with only 41% of companies having targets. So there's a lot more nuggets of information, so I encourage you all to take a look at that benchmark. But to sum it up, I think investor mobilization and engagement is really helping move the dial and mitigating on the ground this water risk. But progress is uneven and not fast enough. So a lot more needs to be done, but definitely a powerful lever.
Thank you, Kristen. You were lucky that you're not next door. I've stopped you before. Yeah. But anyway, very interesting the fact that you're not only looking at targets or benchmarks within the operations of a company itself, but you're looking at the supply chain. Very interesting about the context. So you're really, you're really looking at wider things, and I think it's a lesson for all of us as well on how to do that. So we'll be very interested to find out more. Luke, you have a very important role also. You are advising public equities, and you are in the interface, between water risks analysis and what institutional investors are doing, Mm-hmm. And what makes a difference for water investors? How do we have to, for these big investors, what do we have to do to really make a difference with them? Yeah.
Good question. Well, thank you for being here, and thank you for the question. Just to introduce Jefferies. Jefferies is an investment bank, and as Josefina was mentioning, my job is to advise the world's investment community, really, on sustainability factors, of which water is a big one, or has been for us for the last couple of years. Within that, I should say that, but my aim, of course, really is to help them maximize returns, right? That is, so my job is to help them make money, right? Which we think sustainability is integral to, right? So our clients are the likes of BlackRock and Amundi and AXA and the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund and everyone, really. Who cares about this is sort of an interesting question. Sorry, I shouldn't say it like that. But it varies dependent, really. A big variable in that is your time frame, right? If you are an investor who has very short time frames and very short holding periods, specifically hedge funds, right? They may hold a stock for a day. Mm-hmm. This is not the topic for them, right? No. Whereas there is huge pools of capital, conversely, at the other end of the spectrum, where water is really, really vital to their investment process, right? And they're typically the ones that have long time horizons, long holding periods. They can be pension funds too on the asset owner side, and they're called long onlys, right? So the long onlys really, really care about this, right? The interesting thing about water as well is that unlike many sustainability factors, today particularly, at present, water has it certainly has a cross-Atlantic buy-in, let's say. The US investor is as engaged on this as the European, mm-hmm. which you can't say too often nowadays. And in APAC, this is really, really quite pressing as well. So there is quite international buy-in on this, as long as this sort of time frame element is sort of solved for, right? You asked in terms of how can we engage with these investors, which I may get into in the following question, because I do want to get into how you actually value a company, but we may get into that. I would echo Antonio's point, which is that more so today than ever before, at least when talking to public equities investors, I am only talking to them through the lens of dependencies now. Okay. The impact side of this, which had some momentum, let's say 3 to 5 years ago, at least in my conversations with public equities investors, where I think it's a little bit different in other asset classes, it's falling on deaf ears. And that is more a reflection of where sustainable investing more broadly is today, which is not in the most strong position. It's in a weaker position, certainly, than 5 years ago, which means that every conversation now has to be through the lens of financial materiality and delivering and maximizing returns, which, by the way, was always the exam question, right? We actually sort of, this industry strayed a little bit from that exam question 5 years ago. But anyway, and water firmly fits into that equation. The topics that are absolutely having traction with public equities investors today, PFAS, absolutely. The US is leading on that, not Europe. It is the US investor that is way more advanced on that. And even more interestingly within that, it isn't policy dependent, because under this administration, a lot of those policy drivers have been weakened, if not removed. The leading driver is litigation, right? Okay. And that's really fascinating, because a weakness, again, across sustainability factors quite broadly is often that it's so policy dependent. And we live in deeply politically uncertain and volatile times. And so that is a fundamental weakness to any argument with an investor. I would also say that the data centers part, which has already come up so many times today, which is astonishing, of course is front of mind for investors. However, again, I think as Antonio said as well, we are trying to have a more nuanced conversation with clients about that, meaning it isn't just data centers are big water guzzlers. They're not. There are many that are not. And there are many, indeed, as Antonio was saying, based on their cooling solutions and their efficiency and so on, make no water footprint whatsoever, right? And I can point to, if you look at one of the hyperscalers, I'm not allowed to name names, one of the hyperscalers' activities in Sines in Portugal, it is using, and it's 1.2 gigawatts of data centers, by the way, so 200 megawatts, using solely seawater. Desalination. Because water scarcity is a huge issue in that location. So again, it's all about credibility, right? And a lot of, again, our sort of ESG sustainability community have conducted analysis that has partially discredited the industry a little bit. And we are trying to have a slightly more nuanced conversation on that.
Luke, we had a little discussion before, and I asked you, because you are advising all these investors, and what is the impact of your advice on their decision-making? Can you say something about that?
I said I have no idea, because they're not allowed to, well, maybe they are allowed to tell me, but they never do, right? They may come out of a 60-minute meeting with me and say that was the worst 60 minutes I've ever spent, Or they may leave that meeting and completely change their portfolio, So I don't know. But what I do know is that we talk to everyone, and so probability-wise, we may have some impact.
And I have a second question. That's a very important answer, but anyway, you would argue that this idea of the dependencies versus impact, I mean, the impact is more related to reputational issues, you think? And maybe now dependency is more like, returns, basically.
It's definitely true that that's the counter-argument, of course, and some slightly more advanced, slightly more ethical European investors will say that to me, saying that there is indirectly a financially material risk there. It just goes through the vector of reputational risk going back to financial risk. That's one additional layer of complexity. Okay. Which is never ideal. And two, we at least hold the view that of the risks that we could talk about, reputational risk is pretty low in that hierarchy. The market often doesn't care. So, so that's unfortunate.
Okay. Thank you, Luke. We're going to go to a second question, and this is a bit shorter answer, I hope. Tom, the second question is really about what we need and how are we moving forward. So it's a little bit on the question of the roadmap, what we have to do next. So we want our panelists to try to help us think about, our roadmap. And Tom, really all this disclosure is voluntary, and is it going to be fast enough? Is it going to be dealing with the water, in a way, risks fast enough? What do we need? What do we need from regulators? What do we need from, I don't know, financial supervision? In order to move on from something which is voluntary to something that is more widely applied?
I think it's not just about disclosure, it's also about doing that internal assessment, right? So I think the assessment is the bit that, and the internal management, so understanding what are the dependencies for this business, what are the impacts they're having that expose them to sort of liability risks in the future. And so I think the first thing I'd say is getting that assessment to be much more widespread and embedded. So I've talked about some leaders that are already, we've heard from some leaders that are already doing like really interesting analysis, but there's a long tail of companies that aren't thinking about these issues at all, and even getting them to just do an initial basic screening with a tool like Encore or WWF risk filters, these freely available tools that anyone can just pick up. That would be like a really good start, just getting companies to recognize, oh, we do have a potential exposure to something here. So I think that's the first step, is mainstreaming even the basic practices. And then I think for the sort of companies that, or the financial institutions that have done that, is sort of starting to edge forward the system by asking better questions of their clients and of their investees, and setting out their expectations. So all the stuff that Kirsten was talking about, like, what are your expectations? What information do you want from your investees about their nature-related issues, their locations, so that you can then understand your own risk portfolio, the risk in your own portfolio. And the data providers can also understand what you need and can start to also reinforce that and develop some of the solutions. So I think there's sort of, it's very easy to sort of just say, oh, there's no data, but as part of it is participating in a collective effort to edge forward that system and make clear what is needed so that everyone can start to provide that. And then finally, I think we need to start thinking more about opportunities as well. So we've talked a lot the past few sessions about all the risks we're facing with nature. There are also opportunities here. Providing finance for better water efficiency to reduce demand and therefore mitigate some of the risks we're facing. Providing finance for the development of those technologies. We've heard about data centers and how there's like lots of different technologies out there, and how you can sort of shift some of the dependencies away from the more risky end of things. But then understanding also what are the knock-on effects of that. So you can go for desalination, but then you have a big new energy dependency and a big new pollution impact. And so how do we understand those sort of complexities and work that way forward whilst sort of thinking through the opportunities? And then you asked about like governance and regulation. So TNFD is as I said, a voluntary initiative, but we are seeing progress. Obviously, the European regulations are back out for consultation again, so we need to look in detail about what's happening there. The ISSB is also doing work very focused on the financial materiality piece and trying to understand exactly what information investors actually need. And I think investors' input into that process will be really valuable when the consultation comes out, to make sure that what they put out is meeting that need. So I think there's stuff happening, but I'd really put emphasis on getting that assessment process really embedded.
Yeah, it's a moving architecture, no?
Yeah.
Thank you, Antonio. So now is your time you can go on saying, making your contribution. But what I wanted to say is that, I mean, what does your bank needs from, regulators, supervisors? You're already ahead, no? I mean, I think maybe that's something important, but what is really important is not to think about these regulations that become a compliance exercise, no? Because then, what's the point? At the end of the day, what we want is what you are really doing, is to make sure that this has an impact on operations, no? So.
Well, to start with a positive tone, I think that it's very, very valuable. Some initiatives from the supervisor, from the ECB, in the sense that they are being collecting the best practices in the industry and they are disseminating this. And I think this is very, very, very useful for us. This provides us very, very good insights. This helps us to move forward and to move fast. In parallel with this, we have a very valuable initiative that is hosted by the EBF, that is the CESG Roundtable, where main practitioners in the industry in Europe share our practices, we share our ideas, and we explore how to do things. We meet regularly in different working groups, and every 3 months we have a roundtable. We have a meeting where the ECB participates and provides feedback on the discussions that we have. So this is extremely useful for us. But if I had to say, what do we need? I think we need climate, natural capital and water-related scenarios that are robust enough, and that are usable for our practical use, for our exercises. And I think that a strong collaboration between supervisors and international institutions is needed. This is more challenging than having climate scenarios. As you know, this is much more complex or multi-dimensional. So this is an effort that is worth trying to make. And of course, we have the challenge of data. I think that, we have voluntary frameworks like CDP that are very useful, but we still have data gaps, for instance, in the middle market segment. And at the same time, we have this simplification efforts in the disclosure in Europe that I think were very, very necessary. But we need to strike a balance between this simplification effort and the pressure that the banks have to increase our capabilities for risk management and for disclosure. So I think that there is margin to improve the balance between the pressure that we feel and the data availability that we have in the end. Because if not, we are going to make decisions based on proxies, and I don't feel comfortable making decisions in the real life based on proxies, and for sure this creates a lot of friction with the business teams. I'm talking about decisions at client level. Finally, I would like to stress the massive effort that embedding or onboarding capabilities like geolocation of assets, visualization tools, modeling hazards, etc. This means a huge effort for the banks, for the banking sector. This is new stuff for us. So every help that we can have from the institutions is welcome. And for instance, events like this are really, really helpful. And other examples, like for instance, the ECB has organized a workshop on physical risk for banks now in June. There is another workshop from Copernicus in June. All these initiatives are really, really necessary and are really welcome for us because we cannot do this alone, and we need to share best practices and to build this along together as an industry.
I like your answer because I think a lot of what has been transpiring, and we have talked with the Bank of Spain as well, is that we don't want to have another reporting obligation to banks that it really adds on bureaucracy, if you want. You really want things which are useful and for the bank operations, So those kind of things you are saying, basically, is the kind of role that you would expect from the supervisor to help, in making this type of operations work.
Yeah, but for instance, Pillar 3 requirements keep growing. This is an example. No? So we need to find this balance.
Yeah. Okay, Antonio, thank you. So, Kirsten, what you are doing is great. How can we make it at a scale? How can we really generalize it? What are your ideas? What tactics do we need to really make things happen in a broader level, especially in places like the US. I mean, we were discussing before, and I think also in the conference, in the Water Intelligence Conference, no, that in the US it's not easy for the NGOs now.
Yeah, we are definitely facing some headwinds, but I think there's some positive trends. I think for me, just seeing the interest from institutional investors in the issue of water risk and wanting to engage with us and through our initiatives is very promising. We have the trend in the right direction. Of course, we're working with 110 institutional investors representing 18 trillion in assets under management. We need to double that. We need, more and more folks to come to the table, but we have seen a lot of promise. We've seen a lot of interest in investors getting really curious about water risks within the high-tech sector that has been discussed. So, trying to really, seize upon that interest and support them. So I think there's some good trends to see, but we need to work to elevate this on agendas. And so I think similar to Antonio's comment, we need to work together. We're all the enlightened here in this group, and we need to work together to elevate the issue to capacity build. I think, water can be a scary issue for some, many dimensions, complexities. So how can all of us help to, really set the expectations, unpack the many complexities, get out ahead of, where are the material risks within the value chain? For so long, we've had corporates, just focusing on, their operations where, the risk really typically doesn't lie there. So really sort of unpacking those complexities, get ahead of emerging risks like, the data center issue, and really helping investors understand those issues and be able to then engage. I think to the previous point, there's a lot of complexities there, but, there's also more to the story when you start to unpack things like the cumulative risks of many data centers going into the same basin and drawing from energy supplies that also have a water footprint. So helping unpack these complexities, I think, are really important. On the policy and regulation side, Ceres has long supported our colleagues. On mandatory disclosure, obviously that's stalled somewhat in the United States. We've had some success in California, the fourth largest economy, so there still are some bright spots. I think that's definitely an area where we'll continue to focus on. Unfortunately, right now in the U.S., we are playing a bit of a defense role to uphold the fiduciary duty of financial institutions with various policies that are being proposed a lot at the state level. You don't often hear of what's going on within the states. Currently, we're tracking 45 pieces of legislation in various states as sort of our high priority. That's not even all of the legislation that's out there that, while, yes, it's special interests that are focused more on the climate side, so water is somewhat buffered, water can get swept into that. So definitely playing a defensive role there, but hopefully we can hold the line and just together with all of you in the room, bring more folks to the table on these critical issues.
Thank you, Kristen. Luke, something similar, no? But I think we need to talk differently to investors, no? To try to take this to scale, to really, understand, no? Make investors understand, the materiality of water-related risks to them. So what would you propose?
I mean, that's exactly it. The way to engage investors is really, really simple, right? You use their language and you talk in their terms, right? Finance isn't going to come to us. We've got to go to it, right? The scientific community needs to do that. The NGO community needs to do that. Each other different stakeholder group needs to skill up if they're trying to engage investors on the language and the terms that matter to them, right? And then, point two, you present a different view, right? You challenge their assumptions and you present a different view. Now, In equities, funnily enough, that's really, really easy. Fortunately, right? It's really easy. What do investors do? Investors are trying to value a share of a company, right? To do that, it's very, very simple. You forecast that company's cash flows to perpetuity, and then you discount them back to their present value. And then if you're an investor and your estimated present value, if it's above the current price of shares, you buy some, and if it's below, you sell some. So it's really, really simple. And when you think about that, even just that basic premise gives you an idea of some of the levers that you can pull, right? The discount rate. The discount rate is the cost of capital. Well, if you think one company is going to have a higher cost of capital than its peers because it operates in an area of water stress and water scarcity, and it has dependency on water, that's going to be, you need to integrate that into your model, you need to reflect that in your outcome, and then you go to investors going, that's weird, I've got a different conclusion than you have, right? So you can play with the discount rate and the cost of capital, and you get all sorts of fun results, or you can try and adjust your assumptions on future cash flows. What about higher costs for a company in the future? What if it's operating in an area of higher water pricing? Or if it's operating in an area of water stress, then it's having to invest more capex up front. All of this increases the cost of goods sold, which reduces your future cash flows. Or the top line may come down, your revenues, right? So simple. And you just say, look, I've made a different assumption than you because of X, Y, and Z. And as a result, I think you should potentially reconsider your allocation. So we have to talk in the language that matters, which is cost of capital, revenues at risk, cost of goods sold, capex inflation. You do that, you'll get an audience for what you want to do.
Thank you. It sounds simple, but...
It is simple. It is simple.
But it isn't. I think, I'd like to, before I hand on to you, if you don't mind, I think I'd like to ask Joe from CDP. Can we have a microphone here? These are here, no? Here. Joe, we've been talking a lot about disclosure, and there is a number of financial institutions in your database, no? And we are asking all, the panelists, whether it has made a difference, this disclosure. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that's a big question. Fascinating conversation this morning. Thank you. A few quick reflections from the data. So as most of you will know, CDP collects corporate data, real economy data, and has done for more than 15 years now, specifically for water. But we also, since 2022, thanks to the great efforts of Kate and her team at that time, have been collecting data from financial institutions directly. So in other words, surveying FIs and asking, what are you doing about water risk? What's your level of awareness? How do you even assess your impacts, your water risk exposure? So a few quick highlights to pull out on that from our 2025 data set that are relevant for this conversation. In 2025, out of around about 300 financial institutions who answered that part of the survey, 54% say that they assess their portfolio's exposure to water-related risks and or opportunities. 55% consider water-related information about clients or investees as part of their due diligence and risk assessment processes. But then to Luke's point about impact not necessarily cutting through in the way that it used to a few years ago, only 29% say that they measured the impact of their portfolio on water, that double materiality lens. The majority of those are banking institutions. So I think there's a couple of different ways we can interpret this. If you are a glass half full kind of person, you can say, well, these are major players. We're talking about 300, many of which are the largest institutional investors in the world. We've got many trillions of dollars of assets under management here. So, arguably there is a critical mass of awareness. The flip side to that is just looking at the numbers the other way. Almost half of this sample of FIs don't assess their portfolio exposure to water. Almost half don't consider water-related information as part of their due diligence processes, and less than a third are taking that double materiality lens to the topic. So depending on your perspective, there are different stories to tell here. Final point, I think all of this underlines the absolute imperative of central bank and supervisory engagement on this topic.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a good conclusion. I like to handle, I have a very easy job in this panel, really, because I have Kate Lamb, who is going to be our discussion, so I don't have to make summaries or whatever. Kate is the freshwater lead at UNEP FI, and leads the organization's engagement with banks, insurers, and investors, and she's playing a key role, really, Kate, in bringing us together and keeping us going in all this process. So there's a lot of things happening for us to be all here, no? Kate, I know you have, good questions for our panelists and good reflections. Maybe we can bring in something that I think we haven't talked about, but I would like to also bring it in, which is the question of water pricing. What effects it has on investors' decisions, on banking decisions, whether that will help with the financial materiality of water-related risk. But that's my question, but maybe, we can embed it in your...
How much time do we have? I mean, we need an entire day on water
no,
pricing.
we have a little time. I'll tell you why. Because we have about 15 minutes.
Fabulous, fabulous. Well, then we'll make the most of those 15 minutes and eke every little piece of water out of it. Because, and thank you, panelists. It was a really excellent discussion. And I think in reflecting, before we move on to the pricing question, we heard some fantastic examples of great leading practice, right? Kirsten, Tom, Joe, Miriam, and the WWF team that are in the room, the OECD team, myself included, we're possibly some of the hardest working people in the room from a water perspective. We have been pushing water uphill with financial institutions for easily 20 years now, and it's insanely gratifying to have you all here and to have different faces in the room to speak to. But at the moment, what we've heard is all of the interventions, even undertaking some fantastic research with Luke and the team on looking at the way in which corporate valuation might be skewed in the wrong direction because of these dependencies on water, all remains in the voluntary basis. Antonio is a fantastic leader. BBVA have done fantastic work, not only on his side of the house, but also on the other side of the house, where they have issued the first ever water footprint loan, which ties the rate of interest for the Iberdrola, which was the corporation that benefited from this, not only to achieving a CDP A score from a water perspective,
Thanks
but
for
also
mentioning, because I didn't have the time.
No, of course, I'm going to do this for you because it's absolutely fantastic. But also to achieving a 40% reduction in freshwater withdrawals. And if the company achieves that, it achieves a lower rate of interest. Like that, for me, is the perfect market intervention. But we've only seen one of them. And again, it was a voluntary mechanism. BBVA did it because there was a market demand from the client. There was a point of differentiation, so it could beat its customers. It could beat its competitors, which you did very beautifully. Well done. But we also want everybody to lean in and create these types of products. There's a saying in the water community that a rising tide lifts all boats. I've heard Kirsten say this multiple times. And we know that as much of the leadership on display here, whether it's the institutional investors that Kirsten is engaging, whether it's the 700 companies that are disclosing, the 10,000 companies that are disclosing on water to CDP, they will all still be exposed to risk. And the banks and insurers and investors that are financing these institutions will also be exposed to risk. And fundamentally, the communities that are dependent on this resource for their livelihoods and for their way of being will be exposed to risk, because there's a whole heap of other market participants that either don't care, that should, or that they do care, but they don't really know what to do. And they're designing, constantly reinventing the wheel. So at UNEP FI, we've got almost 600 banks and insurers. I've been on webinars with them for the last year with around maybe at least 1,000 individuals from a range of different banks all across the world, whether that's banks in Mongolia, insurers in Japan, banks and investors in the US. they're all making it up as they go along at the moment. They're all reinventing the wheel from a risk assessment perspective, and in doing so, wasting valuable time and energy and coming up with different conclusions, which in some respect is, again, a market advantage. It's a competitive advantage. If you get that assessment right, then you're going to win. You're going to beat your clients, which is ultimately lesson number one in the market. But arguably, you're only going to get it right for so long, because it is possible to be a clean fish in a dirty pond. And as a result, it's great to be doing all the good things if you're a single institution, working with your portfolio. But if everybody else around you is not doing the right thing, you will still be exposed to risk. You will still have farmers allowing their PFAS to enter into the water, and you will still be dealing with this risk. So the question ultimately, I think, that remains in this room, and that one that we should be exploring, and rather than asking it to the panel, I think I'd love it to ask it to the room and give you guys the opportunity to ask the panel the questions, because you've heard enough from us already, and you're all looking a bit tired and needing a bit of a boost, is how quickly can we move? You know, is it okay that we remain in this voluntary space because of the good examples that we're seeing? And if it isn't, what needs to change? And how do we specifically take that forward in tangible mechanisms that mean that it's not only BBVA doing this, but it's the mid-size bank round the corner that's similarly compelled to act on this topic? So thank you, Josefina, for that, for a moment to share my views on this.
I love listening to you. Anyway, so maybe we can ask.
Please, I think so.
Any questions for our panelists? Yeah.
Good morning. Thank you very much for these 2 days of conversation. My name is Paula Henry from the Spanish Climate Change Office. So here we have heard a lot about climate risk management and also about water risk management. From the Climate Change Office, within the adaptation team, what we are watching with some concern is how difficult it is for companies to understand what is the climate physical risk that they need to report, that they need to focus on. And I think water provides a very good example of when thinking of climate risk management, what is the differences between mitigation and adaptation. So where can we draw this line to establish a minimum common denominator on what needs to be considered as good adaptation, good enough adaptation, included to not jeopardize those efforts that are made by companies in mitigation and which are reported and considered as climate risk management.
Thank you. I'm going to take a few more questions. Yeah.
Yeah. My question is for Antonio. My name is Maria Nieto. I'm now with the LSE, with CETEX, and formerly Bank of Spain. My question to you, I think, is very interesting, and I put it with what Irene said yesterday in the session, is your focus on dependencies versus risk. I found that extremely interesting. And I was wondering, being just somebody external to a bank or having ever done anything related to risk, whether this is the stage on your analysis, to the extent that once you have identified all the dependencies, your focus seemed to me, from this point of view, that would be focused on the risk. Whether this reasoning is correct or not, that's my question.
Thank you. I think we'll take one more. Anybody? Yeah. Caroline. You introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello, thank you. Carolyn from WWF. I have a question, and maybe it's again related to the room, not necessarily to, or also to the panel. I'm happy to hear the inputs there. And I just wanted to say I really appreciated the very frank inputs from you, Luke. Thank you for that. And I think that's kind of what triggered my question now, and also what Kate was mentioning, as well as what we heard from Joe about kind of how impact assessments or considerations are not really kind of part of the business, like don't make sense from a business point of view at this stage for most. And I'm wondering how this is perceived as well from the supervisory community if we come to a state where financial institutions don't assess their impacts, but collectively that is actually causing a risk buildup in the system, which brought us actually why we're in the room here today to begin with. And so I'm curious from this kind of endogenous risk perspective that we also heard in the presentations yesterday on the conceptual framework from the NGFS, how this all fits together basically, and how we can kind of overcome that issue where we just leave it up to voluntary, kind of things that make sense from a business point of view, but actually from a systemic point of view can be quite detrimental.
Maybe Caroline, that question goes a little bit beyond, the panel itself, but maybe we can also discuss it. Okay, so I come back to the panel to see whether you have any comments on that. I think there is these questions on dependencies versus impacts, which I think both of you can say something about that. And I think there is also a question from the Office of Climate Change of Spain, which, by the way, they have done a very interesting analysis on the systemic risk of water with all the other risks related to climate change, and is the one that has more links to any other risks. So I think in that way, that's important. But maybe you can also talk about, what I understood from your question is really what is the sector implications, how the sectors are reporting on mitigation, and how does that affect also adaptation. But I don't know whether you want to make some comments on that. Kristen, you want to start?
Sure. Well, I can maybe touch on the dependency versus impact piece. I mean, I think, I think when you maybe hone in on various sectors, it's maybe more visible sort of where the impacts are creating a risk. And so sort of linking those pieces. And just to give an example, when we look at our benchmark data, the apparel sector is really looking at impacts of water quality, regulations, and as a result is doing a lot more to mitigate those pieces. So another example would be again back to high tech and data centers. We are seeing I think throughout the globe, but it's definitely in my face in the US, all of the data center discussions and social license to operate discussions that are canceling projects. Some really staggering figures came out in Q1 of all of the projects that have been stalled and permits delayed. So I think, sometimes diving a little deeper into the sector, I think can help us look at sort of that impact side a little bit more and really sort of start to pencil out more of where there really are risks associated with those impacts.
Thank you. We have 4 minutes, so
I didn't,
1 minute.
I didn't want to mean that we don't pay attention to impacts. There is, you have dependencies and impacts, and our approach is that we identify both in our portfolio at sector, at subsector level, and even at activity level in a very granular way. But when we want to build, for instance, a natural capital score, we put some more weight in dependencies than in impacts, but we consider both. The question is that if you want to measure impact, sometimes data is more challenging than dependencies. In dependencies, if you have the location of the client and you have the stress, the water stress of the area, etc., you can build some kind of dependency score. But impact is difficult and depends, in many cases, on disclosure. But we consider both. And a good example is data centers. We are talking a lot about data centers. And connected with what Luke was saying before. I had the chance to be in the CERA Week in Houston some weeks ago, and this is a place where all the energy sector discusses all this topic, and data centers impact was a hot topic. And there was a lot of concern about how to deal with the impact of data centers and the relationship with local communities. Because if you don't manage this properly, this can be a source of litigation that you were mentioning, and investors are concerned about this. So of course we pay attention to this, and this is part of our admission guidelines. How do you manage in the case of data centers, how do you manage your impact? How do you deal with local communities? How do you deal with this growing opposition that is we are seeing, for instance, in the US? So we consider both dimensions, of course.
We have 1 minute, so yes.
Can I just quickly make a couple of comments? Just on the first point on adaptation and climate. We did sort of 3 months' work on flood risk in Europe, trying to get investors really engaged on that topic. And I think it sits at the intersection of your adaptation work and obviously water. And we failed massively, right? Investors fed back with them, you know, kind of a shrug, right? But maybe I'm just going to provide the feedback that we received, which might be able to help you in your own sort of work, right? So some of the pushbacks we received were things like, well, for issues like flood risk, the past is actually no indicator of the future. Because where there have been floods in the past, often resilience has been built, right? And therefore, it's actually no read across whatsoever, so it makes it even more difficult to forecast, right? The point was also then when we were sort of saying, you know, oh, well, a flood risk event in this location is going from being a 1 in 20-year event to a 1 in 10-year event. And they go, well, when in those 1 10 years is that going to happen? Because I only hold a stock for 5. And then similarly it goes on, which is, well, okay, even if an issue occurs and a company does take a financial hit, surely it invests capex and solves the problem and therefore has higher resilience again going forward. So it's an acute risk, not a chronic one. And these are all really good points, by the way. So we were like, great point. And then just finally on the systemic risk point, just because it is where so much of this industry is going in the sustainable finance world. It's being spoken about a lot more. I'm not yet fully sure what I think about that yet, but what I would say is that, again, with public equities investors, your conclusions will be relevant at a sector level, because you will be able to say this sector is impacted in this way, this sector is impacted in this way, but because it's a systemic risk, you ultimately won't be able to derive idiosyncratic conclusions. This company is more at risk than this company. And therefore, this conversation around systemic risk, which obviously is exactly right, and planetary boundaries, don't get me wrong, I'm just speaking completely neutrally. And again, it comes to that point where then if you don't get to company-specific idiosyncratic risk, then the conversation is going to be somewhat limited.
Thank you. You want to
Sorry,
talk about the systemic risk?
Yeah, well, no, so I think it's quite related to this disclosure point, right? So if we're just looking at, if companies are just disclosing with a financial materiality lens about their own particular operations, so I agree with Luke that actually it can be quite simple for a financial institution looking at equities, you know, as Luke was describing, and really it's about familiarizing themselves with the topic a bit more and understanding these are the kind of assumptions and scenarios you can build in. But that's sort of, sorry, I'm wrapping up a bit.
I know, we are beyond our time, 2 minutes, so.
But I think, just my point is that it comes up to the limit of what's possible with disclosure, I think, and I think there's this gap between what's financially material for an individual company versus the information investors actually need in order to be able to understand the risks in their portfolios. And this gap is something that I think we need to explore a bit more.
Thank you. I'm sorry for rushing you. Thank you very much. I think we can give a round of applause to this fantastic panel. Thank you.